not every ewe lamb you pick at this stage of the year is going to turn into the super hogget you want. And equally, there is years like this where you might have to cull a little bit harder on the mature ewes, and have them extra ewe lambs or hoggets coming in allows you to maintain your number. When you're starting to draft lambs, is to make sure that your best ewe lambs picked off, and do keep those couple of extra. And this is the benefit you get out of it. You know, you can allow you to cull a bit harder in a difficult year like this and have stock to come in and replace it.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Dr. Frank Campion joins us in this week's episode as we discuss getting the ewe flock in the right condition for mating. Frank discusses some of the key tasks that need to be completed at the moment. We discuss ewe condition on the better farms post-weaning and some of the causes of low body condition in ewes at present. We also discuss the management of replacement hoggets on the farms. We finish up discussing nutritional requirements, grazing management and keeping sufficient number of replacements. We hear now from Frank.
The clock is ticking, and I suppose at this time of year, kind of that period between weaning and just up to mating, we can sometimes be forgiven for maybe taking our eye off the ball with the ewe flock and thinking, look, they're out there, they're grazing off a few paddocks, they're out of the way. But you need every bit of kind of 7-8 weeks pre-mating to get the ewe right. So in terms of going through it, picking out the culls, so you'll have marked some of the culls throughout the year, but actually handling others again now, checking mouths, checking the basics like that, because additional ones will have cropped up along the way that you'll have missed or that won't be marked. So making sure they're removed and making sure that all the ewes are going to be fit and sound. And I suppose a big component to that too then is looking at ewe body condition score. This year has been a particularly, I suppose, difficult year insofar as we had a very difficult spring, and then we went into an unusual type summer where we had, parts of the country were complaining that we're getting too much rain, parts of the country were telling us they weren't getting enough rain. And I suppose it has probably knocked the ewe condition a bit harder than maybe we'd have seen other years. So now the challenge is to get that back on before mating.
I suppose, Frank, let's put that in context. You're 100% right at the first, but we need to really spend a little bit of time with our flock. Now, we're not talking about a lot, but doing some of the basics you're talking about there, making sure we're working with the ones we need to work with the culls out of it. In terms of condition score, look, this is not the first time I talk to you about this. It's a topic that's come up a lot. We came through a bad year last year, as you indicated there. This year has been bad. And one of the other challenges probably this year, Frank, is we haven't had an abundance of grass. Like, growth rates have been low. Probably some of that natural improvement that would have happened just because, look, there was excess grass, they got a bit better dew. Didn't really probably happen in a lot of cases this year.
No, it didn't really happen in a lot of cases. And I suppose the last few weeks where we did have grass, it would have been prioritised, and probably rightly so, towards the lamb flock. So yours are probably that little bit lighter in condition than we would have seen in other years. And I suppose as part of the Better Farm programme, traditionally we would have always condition scored yours at mating time, but this year we've, I suppose, started looking at it in a bit more detail, and we've condition scored at mating last October. We went in again at mid-pregnancy around the time of scanning, and we condition scored all the ewes in the flocks over the last couple of weeks as well. And definitely looking at that data, there are a lot of tin ewes knocking around flocks, and that's going to be the same for every flock. So the challenge now is trying to get them identified and get the condition back on them.
So let's just put this in context. We stayed there earlier, we're 6 to 7 weeks out. It's not the end of the world, we still have time to put on condition. You've been in recent years, have scored those flocks. Maybe just give us a little bit of picture of what you're looking at in those flocks in terms of condition. Maybe first, if we start with where you kind of expect them to be now relative to target, and what you're actually seeing in the flocks at the moment.
Yeah, so look, at this stage of the year, just after weaning, the flocks are going to be at their thinnest, okay? So I suppose the idea behind body condition score, Kieran, is it's essentially a sink and a store for energy for the ewe. So at times like this, when she's dry and her own energy requirements are low, she effectively builds back up her condition and she puts muscle and fat down onto her back. But then when she comes into times when her energy requirements are high, so particularly during lactation, so right after she lambs and she's trying to produce milk for the lambs, she uses that essentially as a sink and starts mobilising that reserve to give her energy to produce enough milk and make up for the deficit that's coming from the diet. So we'd expect them to be thin at the moment. And what we're seeing basically is that, when we look in the flocks, we see on average basically that the condition score across all the Better Farm flocks was 3.1, but there was a big range in that. It went from 2.7 up to 3.4. But I suppose the average in the body condition score, and I've probably talked about this when I've talked about condition score before, it can kind of hide the true picture. And the way I kind of prefer looking at it on a flock basis is actually looking at a kind of minimal approach. So generally we would say that the target of mating for the flocks would be that they would have as few ewes as possible under a body condition score 3. So our traditional target of mating was to have them an average body condition score 3.5. our way of looking at it with them as well is as few ewes possible, less than three. And we've seen, over the years, take last year, for example, we would have had some flocks that would have had, less than 5% of the ewes, less than body condition score three. And equally would have seen flocks that would have had 25, 30, even higher percentage of ewes that were less than three. But what we're seeing now at this stage of the year is that even those flocks that had very low levels of, we'll say, ewes less than three at maiden time, most of them now are the lowest flock I think we had was 12% of the ewes were less than three, but there's a big range in that. And on average, the flocks had about 30% of the ewes that were less than body score three. So that's not a problem really at this stage of the year. So you have three types of ewe within that. What you're going to have is, I suppose, your ideal ewe. She was in good condition at mating time. She was in good condition at lambing time. She mobilised her body reserves to produce milk, reach her maximum peak milk yield, raised two good lambs. And now she's going to start building that condition back up. So she's okay. So that thin ewe is not a problem. You then have your other type of ewe who maybe is thin for a specific reason. There's an underlying health issue that's not obvious, or maybe there's something we've missed in terms of her teeth, or in terms of something like a fluke dose or something like that. Or maybe she's not fit for the system. So maybe she's not able for the type of system you're running. And basically she's not able to maintain her body weight and her body condition. And then there's a third type ewe, which probably looks like the best ewe in the flock at the minute, but in reality isn't. That's the ewe that's in great condition now, and she looks like a big, strong ewe, but she's probably done very little for us all year if she's managed to maintain that level of condition throughout the year. It's often an indication of a ewe that's maybe lost lambs, or at least not reared good lambs insofar as that she hasn't mobilised her reserve into milk production during lactation. So it's not that having thin ewes is a problem now. It's often an indication of a ewe that's worked well. It's now that we get a handle on how many are there and we put a plan in place to make sure they're back in the right condition for mating time.
Frank, I'm going to throw two other categories. I think you're right in the way you broke them up, but even within that, like our older ewes, obviously you touched on that. They're possibly might fall in that category, not fit for system, especially depending on the way the mouth is on them.
Yeah.
But certainly the ones that's going to struggle a little bit more if we get a hard winter or a hard spring. That depends on how hard you need to cull, what your plan is for them.
Yeah.
They just won't crop out. Probably the other one, though, that could fall into that category, if we're to just split on an age basis, maybe not even one of the rare ewes, and we often forget about them, is our hoggets. Yeah. Especially in the case maybe it's dry hoggets. We're conscious of ones of reared lambs, as ewe lambs, they have to get a good do. But you've also looked at the dry hoggets on the paddock farms. What kind of variation you seen there? What are some of the challenges maybe for some of the farms?
Yeah, to look at that is the thing here, and that's, I suppose, comes back to that thing of, is she's thin? Is there a reason for it? And if you open the mouth and you see that she's a thin ewe, a young ewe, you have a different consideration onto it versus opening the mouth and seeing that maybe the mouth is broken on her. So if you look at the older ewes, and you look in the mouth, and some of them might have the mouth might be broken at this stage, and she might have her work done for you at that stage. She mightn't be able to last the system going forward in terms of being able to keep condition on her and perform adequately. So maybe it's time to move her on out of the system. Equally then on the other side, you'll have your young ewes, and if you open the mouth and it's a young ewe, you're going to give it a different sort of consideration, particularly for ewes, as you mentioned, that have reared lambs. They're going to obviously need a good do now. But I suppose we just looked at some of the variation within the hoggets. And if we take the extreme example, so we looked at two flocks where the hoggets are coming in dry, so they didn't rear lambs as yearlings. And with one particular flock, we saw the ewes were, excellent live weight. They were an average body score of 4. And there was no hoggets less than 3. And, this was quite a sizable flock, so it wasn't as if it was 5 or 10 lambs running around who got a really good doing. But I suppose what it was a farmer who maybe had struggled in this department in previous years and took it on this year, said, no, I'm going to make sure the hoggets are good coming up to mating, and has achieved that. And I suppose the question for that flock owner put to us was, well, do I need to slim them down? And the answer is no. Those hoggets are going to be the ones that, I suppose, have the biggest burden to carry over the next year, insofar as they'll be the ones that'll need the condition the most to burn off to get through the year, get lambs reared and get up to weaning next year. And within a grass-based system, there's no need to do that with them. They'll very quickly fall into line with the rest of them. Equally, then we had the opposite, where there was a flock where, things were under pressure for the year, and the hoggets were always the group that probably got, drew the short straw, insofar as they weren't rearing lambs, they weren't in lamb, or they weren't in that, so they kind of got the bear's patches, they were left to one side. And half of them ewes now are less than body score 3, and they have an average body score of 2.8. So now they have a lot of work to do to get the condition back on them by the time we get to mating time, as I said, because those hogget ewes are the ones that are going to need it the most. And I suppose one of the real lessons we took this year from kind of doing the extra condition scores was, when you get a hard spring and, conditions become more challenging, you know, things like having yours in the right body condition score does help maintain that performance or at least keep a good base in it. And, invariably what we saw when we looked at different variables, be it lamb performance, etc., the flocks where condition score was a problem at mating and again at mid-pregnancy were the flocks that suffered most when the challenges hit then in the spring.
Like if we think about the hoggets there just for a minute, that's 20 to 25% of most flocks out there. So we took that example you give, like a lot of those hoggets, they're thin, but they're also light hoggets. They have less reserves to carry.
Mm.
That is part of what we see during the year, Frank, where look, obviously the wins again as well, but their lamb performance you indicate is going to be back. There's more light lambs lying around the next year. That's part of that vicious cycle in not addressing them now. But I suppose to be fair, they're probably the easiest group to do something with in terms of they're younger, they should be healthier.
Yeah.
They can put it on and maybe a bit easier than the older ewes.
No, they should, exactly, Kieran. Like, so, as you said, they're younger, they're healthier, they're obviously that little bit lighter, so they don't need as much maintenance energy. So, giving them that extra bit of feeding means they'll be able to gain a bit of condition that bit quicker, and they're still in a growing phase. So, they're not an older ewe that's maybe reached their full mature weight. So, it is a bit easier to do something with them. I suppose the challenge for them, as it is for any of the flocks, maybe where they're struggling a bit on condition, is to make sure that you're identifying them on time and putting a plan in place to deal with them, So
Yeah.
I suppose we've been out condition scoring them. That's one of the things we've done. We've marked all the 10 ewes on those flocks, and now there's a plan in place for each flock as to what they're going to do with them.
We talked there about improving condition. Put a little bit of figures on that for me. So, in terms of energy reserves, Frank, how much does it take to do it? And maybe in that, what kind of grazing do they need to be on over the next couple of weeks to achieve that?
Yeah. So look, I suppose if we were to break it down, if we were to think of the ewe in the same way we think of the lamb, right? And you were to take your typical 80 kilo lowland ewe, in order for her to gain half a body condition score unit in the next 6 weeks, we'll say, she'd need to be doing 114 grams a day. Now, what does that mean in context? Well, when we weighed the lambs on the Better Farm recently and looked at what they were doing between 14 and 21 weeks, the average for twin born and reared lambs was 160 grams a day. So to get that sort of performance out of the ewes, they're going to need good quality grass. So what that boils down to then is those thinner ewes need to be treated by what we'd recommend for the lambs, going into swards that are kind of 8 to 10 centimetres pre-grazing, graze them down as far as 6, not being forced to graze them out, moving on quickly, small, short residency periods. And then for the rest of the flock, they can't be neglected either. While you'll have them doing bits of cleaning up behind in the paddocks afterwards, it's again making sure that they're getting some fresh pick of grass. They're not being forced to bear out a paddock and stay there an extra day because you want to hold them up and keep them away from somewhere else, so that they're also getting moved quickly and getting into reasonable quality grass. And that becomes more important the closer you get to mating, of course.
That's a kind of 1 and 2, 1 and 3 scenario where they only kind of go in briefly, clean out, but they're going on to their own fresh grazing again.
Exactly, Kieran, And the challenge for that is, and this is where I suppose the complication comes in, is what we'll see is, the flock that's struggling with body condition score is going to struggle with lamb performance. So you're going to have extra lambs lying around at this stage of the year, extra demand on grass. So it's to get the balance right there so that you don't bring this year's problems into next year. And I think we've said that before on podcasts on about colios and things like that. But now is when you make that decision. So you have to factor it into it, maybe there's a decision to be made around selling some store lambs or introducing a bit more concentrates to lambs, etc., so that you can allow the old flock to get the condition back on so that when it comes to next year, you're not hitting the same problems.
I know I have a bit of an overlap because I'm going to talk to you about the lamb situation of the farms in our next episode, but you do have to draw a line under it at the moment and say, right, where's my priority going to be? And this isn't a carte blanche advice for everybody, but for some flocks, it might be a case, Frank, of saying, my priority is the ewes. Now I need to spend time and effort on pushing them, maybe call a little bit harder on some of them this year. But for a lot of flocks out there, this is year 2 of a difficult year.
Yeah.
They have to draw a line under it.
Yeah, you do. And like, as you said, call a little bit harder. To use very crude and round figures, you'd be better off to have, if your target was to have 100 ewes, you'd be better off to have 90 good ewes than to have 10 passengers there in the system just to say that you have 100 ewes. And that's where that decision comes in now. And I suppose when it comes into condition score, it can often be misconstrued and someone says, oh, we'll get rid of all the tin ewes and suddenly the body score looks great, but that's not actually doing you any good. When we say tin ewe, we're saying, let's say you have a ewe now and she's 2.5, for example, and you mark her. as a tinio, but you come back and you're checking them regularly between now and mating, and she's not responding. She doesn't regain any condition or sufficient or any measurable condition between now and mating. She's the type of ewe that needs to be taken out of the system. However, the ewe that's 2.5 now and reared her lambs and gets back up in condition, and maybe she's only at the minimum mark of 3 or just shy of it come mating, well, she's probably going to be okay because she's shown that she's actually able to regain condition within the system with the correct nutrition. The important thing now is that takes time. So you have 6 weeks now. So I've said it's 114 grams a day roughly to put on that half unit. So any of those tinio is going to need all that time to get back up to that kind of minimum of 3. But I don't think it's a carte blanche case that if it's a tin, if you have tinios now, get rid of them. Be careful. Some of your best ewes are in that. They just need to be managed and given time to recover.
So in essence, let's just keep it simple. You treat those tinios. Hopefully, it's not a big proportion, but you need to treat them like a finishing lamb over the next couple of weeks. And still don't overpunish your ewe flock. Keep them moving. Look, I'm going
just to clarify that, Kieran, just with the treat them like a finishing lamb. Treat them like a finishing lamb with a forage-based diet. Don't go throwing big heaps of concentrate at yours in the run up to mating. So if she's not able to survive and put on condition on a grass-based system, then she's not going to suit your system for the winter and into next spring.
Look, there's one other thing. I'm slightly digressing. I'll finish up with you on this. It highlights one other thing probably at this time of the year, especially for flocks that are keeping their own replacements. Keep enough replacements. It gives you that option that you could cull a little bit harder if you need to, as opposed to, your example earlier, for 100 Joes dropping back to 90. If you have enough replacements coming in every year, you have a little bit more scope. It's possibly something that just should be thought about a little more on farms at the moment. Yeah,
it is, and it's this time of year when we really kind of comes into focus. Like, and as you said, if we have those extra couple of replacements there, you're probably thinking they're a bit of a pain during the year, but it does give you good scope now, because not every ewe lamb you pick at this stage of the year is going to turn into the super hogget you want. And equally, there is years like this where you might have to cull a little bit harder on the mature ewes and have them extra ewe lambs or hoggets coming in, allows you to maintain your number. But now I suppose when you're starting to draft lambs is to make sure that you have your best ewe lambs picked off. And do keep those couple extra, and this is the benefit you get out of it. You can allow you to cull a bit harder in a difficult year like this, and have a stock to come in and replace it. And I suppose if you're following a breeding policy, like we'd recommend, and you talk about on some of the other podcasts, every time you're bringing in those replacements, particularly if you're breeding from within, you're increasing the genetic gain and you're increasing the overall genetic performance of the flock. So there is a benefit to it on multiple levels.
Frank, I think that's a useful update. Look, certainly focus on condition, get your basic checks done, remove your culls at the moment. All that's going to have a big impact on it. Look, we're going to chat in the next episode about the lamb situation on the farms and some of what you discussed there and some of the options maybe for finishing them. So look, we'll catch up with you in the next episode.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks for having me on.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. Frank's going to join us in the next episode as we discuss lamb management on the better farms and some key areas we can focus on for the rest of the year. That's it for me. For updates on the sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.